it's one of those like marginal gains, and it might be a fraction of a percentage. I don't know.
Uh, Start us off.
All right, so today we're talking about recovery, but I think
Active recovery specifically,
active
and
recovery.
we'll talk about recovery as well.
But I think you need to earn your recovery rather than it just be something that you just do.
Okay, and please tell me more, Josh. You got me
All
my
right.
interest
Yeah. So
sparked.
if you listen to Andrew Huberman or Peter Attia or any of the famous people online, they're gonna go into their morning routine or their evening routine and how to optimize for improved performance. Great. Um, but did you put in the work? So if you look at what Peter Attia does, I think he works out like 12 plus hours a week,
Yeah, it's a
which
significant amount.
when you think about it, it's like 12 hours. It doesn't seem like much from the grand scheme, but if you really think about it, it is quite a bit. Um, anyway, so in that case, you probably do need recovery. But if your workouts are short and sweet, or they're kind of here and they're not consistent, you might feel a little fatigued. But you don't need to cold plunge. You don't need red light therapy. You don't need all of this, electrolytes. You don't need the fanciest protein powders. You probably just need a good night of sleep, and you're probably going to be okay. So there's nuance to this whole recovery topic and debate. Um, we can definitely dive into it, but I just don't think if you flip through the internet, you're going to find all of this cool stuff, but the average person probably doesn't need as much of that as they think.
Um, would you say that people who are also experiencing plateaus would probably maybe kind of also maybe then fall into the category would need recovery?
Yeah, I mean, you could argue, are you under recovered or under prepared? And under recovered is definitely a part of it. So, do you know who Dan John is?
Uh, no, why don't you go ahead and tell me?
Okay, so Dan John, famous strength coach, he was a co-author of the book Easy Strength,
Okay.
and part of the concept was basically deloading. And so he was working with some athletes and different high level people, and just doing less gave their body some recovery, and they were able to improve performance. So I think that's kind of what we're talking about, where we're trying to kind of find that balance of work to recovery ratio, if you will.
Yeah. Okay, so kind of want to kind of go into more active recovery and talk about kind of ways kind of get us back in the game and keep us allowing us the ability to keep training. But first, I kind of think we need to talk about a little bit about the kind of like, about the process of kind of what's happening and what's uh, maybe like causing soreness. We know
Sure.
we've probably all heard of this, the DOMS. So basically, whenever you go through a workout and you're exercising and you exercise whatever tissue it is you're going after, whatever muscle group, uh, you end up creating inflammation in that area
Mm-hmm.
just through the movement alone. And then, based on whatever your goal is, whatever intensity you did in that workout, sends a signal to the brain. The brain then relays it to the endocrine system, and then the endocrine system is where I guess you could say that is the last part of the piece of the puzzle to kind of uh, send. It knows since you've had that inflammation occur at a specific area of the tissue. Now the endocrine system can send a response to then allow you to recover and have more like super compensation in that area.
Yeah.
Maybe clean that
So
up a little bit.
um, yeah. So a couple episodes ago, we drew the graph about the stimulus, and then after that stimulus, then there's potentially a little drop in performance, and then the goal is to recover, and then we have this improved performance. So the inflammation, everyone's worried about inflammation. We actually need the inflammation. That's the local stimulus to the tissue that we need to be able to create the change.
Yes. So yeah, inflammation happens where you work out, sends a signal to the brain based off what you did. That goes to the endocrine system. Now the endocrine system knows to send the response, to make the change where that local inflammation is.
Right, and the hormone profile that depending on the type of workout that you did is then going to allow that biochemical process of creating adaptations to allow for the tissue to be able to either produce more force or accept more load the next time you go to work out.
Yeah, and I know early on in my fitness journey, I think I kind of heard the idea that like whenever you work out, you create tears in the muscle fibers, and then they kind of like regrow and rebuild and get stronger from there. That's not how it exactly works. It's because if that were the case, if we were to create tears in the muscle fiber, DOMS would happen a lot sooner. Like if you're creating tears in the fiber, you would experience soreness much earlier on rather than that 24 or 46 hour onset.
Right.
And so what that is just your body's response to the stress that it went under. There's inflammation going on the tissue. That's just kind of compressing on those sensory neurons that are just, and then send us into basically experiencing pain.
Yeah, and then we can even get to the neuromuscular junction. So where the nerve is connecting to the muscle fiber. And there's a theory of where that junction gets fatigued with the neurotransmitter, so it's not able to send the signal across the gap as quickly.
Okay. Because there's inflammation there? Right.
So it's almost like you've exhausted the release of the neurotransmitter, like the fatigue of the nerve firing. The neurotransmitters need time to be able to recycle, if you will.
Okay.
And then there's also central fatigue, where the brain, spinal cord, they just reach a point where they've sent so much of a signal that there needs to be a little bit of a latency before you're able to come back and produce that same, because everyone's had it to where you have a really intense workout, and then if someone said, do you want to do that same workout again, you would say no, right? Well, that's evidence. There's local fatigue for sure, but there's a central nervous system component to that fatigue.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, we've gone through a workout, we have this localized kind of inflammation in the tissue. We need that there to basically, like I said, to know where to create the change.
Right. So we talked about in previous episodes the correct stimulus to create the change, and now we're talking about the recovery so that the change actually sticks.
Yes. So so we got inflammation. How do we treat inflammation without disrupting the change from happening? So essentially we have inflammation. We're trying to send this to create change in specific tissue. We have inflammation there, so blood flow is getting in to that area, which is a good thing because we want to essentially pump in the good stuff and pump out the bad stuff.
Sure.
Now with blood flow, we also have lymphatic system. So this is kind of where everything kind of drains into. You want to maybe talk?
Yeah. So interesting little fact. So we think of the lymphatic system as kind of where the exhaust of like the whole system kind of gets funneled into. Interestingly, though, only 15% of the fluid is within the lymphatic channels. 85% is actually in the interstitial space, which is between the cells. So this gets back to the whole point of active recovery versus some of the passive recovery stuff. And we can kind of contrast that here in a second. But because the fluid is now in the spaces, we actually need the tissues to be able to move the fluid, because the fluid's not just going to move on its own.
Yeah. So, and as we like when we warm up in general, is and the idea is we need to create movement in order to uh, help with this bringing in good things and clearing out the bad things.
Right. So because the lymphatic system is passive, as in, even though the heart is pumping and it's moving blood through the circulatory system, it's not necessarily pumping through the lymphatic channels. So
Well, yeah,
we,
it is. It is fully passive. Even the circulatory system, like the venous system, is there's no active pumps in that. It's all through like muscle contraction, which is really what forces it back to the heart.
correct, correct.
So on this topic, we need to create movement to being active in our recovery process.
Right. So I think you had mentioned earlier about potentially blunting that inflammatory response. So, everyone hears inflammation and everyone's kind of scared of inflammation. Too much inflammation is a bad thing. But whenever we're talking about creating an adaptation to an exercise, we need that inflammatory process as the signal. So if you do a workout and then you go take 2 ibuprofen, well, ibuprofen is going to blunt that inflammatory response. And so you're probably not going to get the change that you were looking for. Same thing as if you jumped in a cold plunge right away. There's plenty of benefits to doing cold plunge. Timing is important.
Yes.
Sauna, same thing. You potentially could get some anti-inflammatory benefits from the sauna, red light therapy, panels, that sort of thing. So we don't want to blunt that response, too much. So we would want to avoid right after doing the exercise to do some of those things. So just because you did a heavy workout doesn't mean you need to optimize recovery right after the workout. You actually need the body, let it sit with that signal for a little while, so the signal actually does something. Because as soon as you do the workout, and then if you go right into like trying to recover, like you kind of miss the point of the actual exercise.
You just want to make sure that the signal that you sent through your workout, that there's actually allows enough time for a little bit of inflammation to know where to create the change.
Right. Yes.
So let's say, when would you want to start this more active recovery process?
Well, active we can start right away. So active is not going to blunt the inflammation response. If you think of the active recovery component, think of that as more of fluid movement and getting things like, so if we've contracted a muscle, we've constricted blood flow to a certain extent. So there can be some stagnation locally within, everyone gets the pump, right? So there can be some stagnation of blood flow within a certain muscle group. So if we can then get the old blood, if you will, out, new blood in, we can enhance nutrient delivery. We can enhance the ability for the tissue to flush out the exhaust of metabolism.
Okay, so some sort of movement. Probably best case scenario, cars.
I mean, cars are the easiest thing for sure.
So those stands controlled articular rotations.
Yes.
Basically, you're taking your joint or tissue through its entire range of motion.
Right. And so we haven't specifically talked about cars and the continuum that you can be on, but in this case, since we're not trying to create a training effect, we're trying to create more of this recovery aspect, we would want to be on the lower end of tension, the irradiation. So these would be that 10 to 30% range, just kind of that morning routine level where we're not creating max tension, just to kind of get the body moving more or less.
This low level effort. So yeah, kind of like in so doing like also like some like zone 1 training.
Yeah, I mean, pick something you like. don't pick something you don't like. So if you like the rower, great. If you like the skier, great. Bike, whatever. Just go for a walk. That's another option. Again, getting the heart to pump in a semi kind of relaxed way, just to, again, flush the entire system, if you will.
So you said going for a walk, and other things you can do besides just movement, things you can kind of add to it. I know we had talked before is uh, also when you go for a walk, you're going to get sunlight. You're gonna,
Yeah, so I mean, sunlight. You're. I just said red light would not be necessarily um, something that you would want to do right after a workout. You're going to get red light naturally from the sun, so there is some nuance to that. You're not going to blunt the inflammation response nearly to the same extent with sunlight as you would if you were directly doing local red light therapy. But the point would be that natural sunlight is going to kind of almost charge our cells to a certain extent. And so if you could get outside, walk barefooted, you're going to get some additional, benefit as well.
and so you mentioned on the barefoot, kind of getting into this idea of grounding. And right, we didn't spend too much time on this, but like, once you walk them through kind of what the general idea of grounding is.
So again, if we think of our cells have an electric charge. Optimal health is basically negative 400 millivolts. And the further we get towards positive, that's whenever we start to see health effects or negative health effects in the tissue. So the more negative we can keep our tissues, the better. So whenever we're grounding, we're getting negative charge into our cells. So typically, I think the research would suggest about 20 minutes is kind of the time it takes to kind of absorb. So spending 20 minutes, barefoot out on the grass would be.
And so also mentioning being on grass and ground is important. Walking on a pavement or sidewalk
Yeah, there's.
is going to be completely different.
Yeah, so the ground, like concrete, you can ground through concrete technically as long as it's uncovered. Like if there's like some sort of sealant on it, you're not going to be able to. But preferably, you are on the ground. And the interesting thing is, so our hands and feet have eccrine sweat glands, which, think of that as like our connector to the earth. So because we have the ability to sweat, that's like what creates the connection to the earth, which allows for those transfer of negative ions.
Yeah, so then basically the Earth's crust has just this free electrons floating around that our body can then pick up, which is regularly discharging positive free radical ions. And this is kind of gets into now, since we're having this buildup of this positive charge, by getting outside and walking barefoot, we're through movement, we're kind of discharging these positive, well, we're kind of moving these positive charges throughout the body, and then by walking outside, we're essentially then having a greater ability to discharge that and pick up more electrons.
Correct. And like that's how we're designed to function. Again, there's all these ways to kind of biohack what nature is giving us, but the best source is just go out and be in nature. One, it's free, so
Yeah.
it's you don't have to have a membership or you don't have to have a fancy device. So it's the most accessible form of recovery.
Okay, so movement. What about things uh, okay, so we was talking about a little bit of like zone one, some just lower. What about zone two? Any benefits as far as zone two?
I mean, zone two is going to be the same for zone one. I would say there's a little bit. I know it's like there's a certain threshold with, again, the intensity. So zone two can be more intense than you realize, but it's still going to
Okay,
get
so
the
let's this. Okay, so let's maybe kind of clarify what zone 1 does and what zone 2 does for those who don't know.
okay. So zone one is basically just walking. It's going to be very low level, and think of that as just getting the tissues moving. You're obviously going to get blood flow to the tissues, but if we were trying to make aerobic changes or VO2 changes, not really going to see much benefit. Now, again, there's always a caveat. If you're severely deconditioned, if you're elderly, or you've been injured and like this is all you can do, different story. But if you're an athlete or if you're an active person, zone one, you're not even going to really feel your heart rate
Yes.
get elevated much at all. So there's benefits. Clearly, there's benefits to zone one, but if we're now starting to look at how we can use the aerobic system to improve the buffer of the positive charge, if you will, um, we need a little bit higher intensity to be able to perform that function.
And what does zone 2 do for us?
So zone two, this is going to be where we can improve mitochondrial density, and that's again, the powerhouse of the cell. The better the mitochondria are able to function, the better we're able to keep that negative charge and buffer the positive charge. So zone two is how we keep our mitochondria healthy. And so if you really want to look at all chronic disease, there's a mitochondrial component. So the healthier the mitochondria are, the better we're able to stave off some of these negative effects.
So is there any, and now would you say that's more for, I guess, long-term active recovery, or is there anything that will happen, I guess, more acutely by doing some zone 2 training after like a heavy intensity lifting day?
Yeah, I would say again, you could really nuance this out, um, because there's the whole interference effect of aerobic training to strength training, and again, they can kind of compete. But what we found, unless you're specifically a competing power lifter or you're a competing, you know, marathon runner, the interference effect is probably not something that we need to worry about. It's something that we can debate on paper, but in reality, it's probably less of an issue. Um, but anyway, so the long-term effects are probably more of what we're talking about. But after a heavy strength training, being a little bit on the less intense side is probably where you would want to, just because you don't want to spend more resources. There's that as well. Just if you just did a heavy strength set or training, um, spending resources on the aerobic side of things, again, you're now competing. Do you have enough fuel to do both?
Okay. Yeah, because I think historically I would always like to try and do some zone 2 training immediately after workout, just because sometimes zone 2 is a little harder for me to get into. Being a CrossFit athlete, our hearts kind of naturally just kind of skip out of zone 2 and go straight to higher intensity. So I usually find after a good workout like zone 2, it's easier for me to get into zone 2, uh, and then like stay in zone 2 uh, after like more of like a higher intensity workout. But uh,
And I would think that the better the like you're going to be able to manage that better, whereas the average person might struggle with that as well. So um, again, it's nuanced depending on who we're truly talking about.
okay. All right, so zone 1, zone 2. What about things in other camps in the active recovery like foam rolling?
So foam rolling, I wouldn't classify that as active. There's an active component of you maybe sliding over the foam roll, if you will. I would say that's more a primer. So if you did some foam rolling and then went and did your walk, or did some foam rolling and then like, there's an additional benefit that you can gain. I wouldn't put stock into foam roll as like the only thing that I would do. But if that's part of like your cool down procedure and you're going to go do some foam rolling, you're going to do some cars, and then you're going to go for a walk, yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of amazing. What does foam rolling do? It'll help increase blood flow.
Yeah, we're creating, a tissue compression, if you will. And that compression, we can get some, whenever we're talking about lymphatic, like we can get a little manual, very similar to what you would get from like a flushing type massage.
Yeah.
So again, we talked about that interstitial space. So if the fluid is between the cells, if you will, there is going to be some movement from foam rolling. But again, we really need the tissue to be actively moving to truly get the biggest bang for our buck.
Yes. Um,
But then there is like a blunting too. So if we look at range of motion, um, pre foam roll than after foam roll, and people are like, oh, I got better shoulder range of motion. There is a little bit of a nervous system like blunting, if you will, to where the nervous system just doesn't have the same threshold of activity. So we can actually get a little bit more range of motion. Is it going to stick? No. But people will tend to use that to kind of open up range of motion before they go do something. We can talk about that differently, but
yeah. So like, if nothing else, if you are sore, maybe, and it's rather than just kind of laying around and just not moving, uh, a little bit of foam rolling, if it can just kind of help get you going to then do more lower intensity calisthenic exercises to kind of really help with uh, the lymphatic system and circulatory system and the recovery process, then by all means, yeah.
Yeah, so if we're able to decrease, the muscle spindle threshold and the Golgi tendon, as far as like the nervous system's like emergency brake on the tissue, and then it feels better. If that's what you want, like there's like, if I was gonna say again, if that was the only thing that you were doing, there's probably a better option. But if that's in conjunction, because that allows you then to do other things, by all means, go ahead.
Foam rolling feels good, but it's probably not doing as much good as you think it's doing.
Yeah, and there's research stacks of it that there's short-term benefit, but it's not making any tissue change. It's not lengthening the tissue. It's not creating range of motion. So all the things that are being kind of talked about that it's doing, there's really evidence to say that it's not. But you feel better, and so if you feel better, there's a rationale of keeping it around.
Yeah. Okay, what about like massage and then kind of maybe even like these percussion massages that are pretty common, like hypervolts and theraguns?
Again, I would put that into like the theragun or the hypervolt, specifically into like that foam rolling kind of category. If you massage the sore area, it feels better. So vibration, again, it's going to dampen the nervous system's kind of threshold of response. And so again, if that makes it feel better, and then you're going to be able to actively contract the tissue afterwards, great. But again, there's no, and again, you're going to get some lymphatic movement, of course, but that's not making any long-term like tissue changes. So again, you're probably going to get some different range of motion benefits. It's not going to stick. So now we take that to massage. So massage, again, is more passive. There might be an active component where they're having you move or something, but again, that would be more a passive approach. There's nothing wrong with it. There's benefits. But if we're talking about active recovery and actively moving the tissues, that's not necessarily going to be like part of this discussion. Um,
Yeah,
Again, why do people do it? Because it feels good, and then it allows them to go do other things, which is where the benefit is.
what about like other things, like other forms of exercise, like yoga, Pilates?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a time and place. I think that there's definitely benefits, and if you enjoy it, go ahead.
It's just helping you create movement, and movement's the key to kind of this whole thing.
Right, absolutely.
Um, any other things on active recovery?
I mean, I think the benefit is in the movement, and most people are they're either unaware, but you need to continue to move the tissue. So it's like you just did a workout, and people are like, I just want to do nothing, or I just want to like unwind or just relax. But what you don't realize is the tissues need to still be moving. So if you do a heavy workout or an intense workout, or you go to Soul Cycle or burn, whatever it might be, and now you're kind of exhausted or drained, um, that's fine. But there's going to be like a stagnation that happens almost after that workout. And if we can minimize that stagnation through these gentler movements, you're going to be able to come back tomorrow and still be able to perform. Whereas you do a heavy workout, you let things get stagnant, then you're going to feel stiff and sore, and you're not going to want to do the workout tomorrow, or not going to want to do the next workout. So the better we can kind of like buffer that stagnation, the better.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to kind of previous things we've talked about. So, what about things like other good things for active recovery, like more lower intensity, like Pale's contractions? So, like the idea is that you've, whenever if you work a joint or tissue out, then we get into that, maybe getting back more into workspace, and as your body gets better at that particular exercise you're doing, our workspace is narrowing so that we can kind of focus our energies on just that particular space we're using. So maybe by doing some uh, active recovery things like putting that joint through its in range and doing some low level contractions at length, Pale's contractions,
Right.
Loading the tissue at length. Uh, that would essentially would be a great active recovery.
100%. So if we think of pails, we're typically, if we're talking shoulder and hip, we're thinking about the actual shoulder capsule itself. We tend to think of the capsule as a passive tissue. We don't think of it as an active tissue. Um, there's more research and evidence to suggest that there is a bit of an active component in the connective tissue. So while we're contracting the hip joint, the shoulder joint, we're actually also changing the fluid dynamics within the joint. So if we can move the joint, we then take the capsule to a lengthened position, we create a contraction, we can actually use the contraction of the capsule to help change where the fluid is in the capsule.
And that doesn't necessarily have to be for a joint too. So like even let's say we did a bicep workout, even on our active recovery days, by throwing in just some low level like Pale's contraction, we can essentially now almost funnel the change process into that specific tissue area, because now we were also increasing of where the signal's coming from where the endocrine response knows where to send its resources to.
Correct. So this goes back into where we were talking about the cars at that lower intensity, that 10 to 30%. So the Pales contraction, if we're looking at kind of 0 to 100, training is going to be that 70+%. This is definitely going to be a sub-max effort in that 30% range. I would say, depending on the athlete, we could take it up to 50, but I probably wouldn't be doing higher level contractions. So I would be doing much more frequent, where it's going to be shorter durations, um, where we're maximizing the signal to the tissue, and then the brain's ability to connect with that tissue.
Yeah, because like whenever you injure a tissue, or maybe injury is not the best, but even when you go through a workout or injury as well, you're creating inflammation both
Yeah.
times. So when the body kind of repairs itself, it doesn't necessarily know how to lay things down properly. So by applying that force component at length,
Mm-hmm.
would that essentially then kind of also aid in like the ability to adapt and create better change? Because now by adding that force component and kind of guiding it where it needs to lay new stuff down.
Yeah. So connective tissue specifically, there's a direction to the fibers. So directionality to the loading is important. So if we take a general exercise like a squat, we're not necessarily specifically loading one area. We're loading the entire hip or the entire posterior chain, if you will. So if we now backfill with these directional Pales contractions, we can funnel the loading into very specific sectors of the tissue that we might need additional work, or we just want to make sure that the loading, kind of that signal, kind of goes to the tissue that we're actually wanting to change.
Yeah. So yeah, we can not only like help with maintaining our workspace, maintaining its size and preventing often combination and that, but also then more on the more on the muscle and connective tissue being able to kind of like guide the adaptation process.
Yeah, so just imagine like a deadlift or a squat, compound lift, multiple body parts involved, right? So you're going to create this really strong stimulus with that. Now you know that the right hip needs like specific work. Now you can help funnel to those specific targeted areas with what we just talked about.
Yeah.
So that, again, that directionality, um, in the direction that the tissue is actually flowing or moving.
Yeah. Anything else?
I just think that the key is not like the cool down is something that is highly debated.
Yeah.
You know, we think about the warm up, we think about the workout, and then we just run to our car, right? So I think that
I think the cool down is very
and
very much overlooked.
there's potential. Like I just saw something the other day where like they basically said it's not that important, but it's like if we're trying. So we've been talking a lot about the signal, right? Did we send the correct signal? Are we using that signal to then create the change that we're looking for? So it's like if we want that to stick, to create the adaptation, we have to funnel the resources to the correct area. And we talk about load is the language of cells. So if we want to speak to the cells, we have to load in the direction that those cells are aligned in. And so the more we can actively funnel appropriate loading into those tissues, the better we can make change to those tissues. So the active recovery component, I think it's overlooked. People want to just jump into the more passive recovery modalities. Again, they're all great. They all have their time and place. But if you jump into a cold plunge and you blunt the response, you're going to miss some of those effects. And there's no directional loading in a cold plunge. It's just, again, a local, I mean, a global versus a local. So if you just did a specific leg workout, you want to funnel those resources into the tissue that you just worked. The active recovery components allow that to happen more specifically. The more specific you can be, the better off, right?
So yeah. So I think just as much movement as we can. If you're extra sore from it, and maybe some foam rolling, some sort of self myofascial release, if it helps kind of get the process going, but get that tissue moving, apply some directional force into it in the way we want it to heal. Get some sunlight, get some grounding. Yeah.
Stay consistent.
Stay consistent.
Yep, I think that's it.
All right. Thanks, Josh.